The world used to know the sound of his laughter, that gentle, smooth, unmistakable voice that filled movie screens and hearts alike. But now, at 76, that voice has grown quiet. Too quiet. For decades, Richard Gere was the symbol of elegance, the kind of man who didn't just play the role of a gentleman, he embodied it. His calm smile, the way he carried himself, the peace in his eyes, it all spoke of someone who had seen both the glitter and the emptiness of fame. But in recent years, that light has dimmed. His absence feels heavy, almost haunting. He no longer walks the red carpets. His name, once echoing through award shows and film festivals, now feels like a whisper lost in the wind. Fans around the world keep asking the same painful question: where is Richard Gere? Some say he's chosen silence. Others fear the silence chose him. At 76, photographs surfaced that broke the hearts of millions. The once radiant face, now marked by quiet age, seemed to carry 1,000 untold stories. Those eyes, the same ones that made the world fall in love during Pretty Woman and An Officer and a Gentleman, still held compassion, but behind them, there was something deeper. A look that said goodbye without words. And yet, no one truly knows what happened. No grand announcement. No explanation. Just a stillness that left fans confused, afraid to even imagine the truth. Because when you finally see what became of him, you'll understand why the world can't stop crying. Long before the flashing cameras, long before the tuxedos and red carpets, there was simply a boy, a quiet, thoughtful boy from Philadelphia named Richard Tiffany Gere. Born on August 31, 1949, in a modest middle-class family, Richard grew up surrounded by love, music, and the comforting rhythm of ordinary life. His father, Homer George Gere, worked as an insurance agent. His mother, Doris Ann, devoted herself to their children and home. They weren't wealthy, but what they lacked in fortune, they made up for in kindness, discipline, and faith. From an early age, Richard's eyes carried wonder. He played the trumpet, excelled in sports, and possessed a rare curiosity about life. Yet, beneath his quiet exterior was a restless dreamer. Someone who felt called to something bigger, though he didn't yet know what it was. At North Syracuse Central High School, he was both athletic and artistic, a talented gymnast and musician. Teachers remembered him as polite, introspective, and driven. Friends recalled that even as a teenager, Richard carried a calmness that made people listen. There was no arrogance, no desperation for attention, just a deep, unshakable awareness that the world had more to offer than what lay before him. After graduation, he attended the University of Massachusetts on a gymnastics scholarship, majoring in philosophy. The combination of physical discipline and intellectual curiosity suited him. Philosophy awakened in him a love for reflection, for the mystery of life, compassion, and human suffering. He began asking questions most people his age never considered. But as time passed, the classroom walls started feeling too small for his spirit. Somewhere inside, he knew that the answers he was searching for couldn't be found in a textbook. So, he left college before graduating, a decision that puzzled his family but changed his destiny. In the early 1970s, Richard moved toward a new world, a world of light, emotion, and storytelling, the stage. He began performing in local theater productions. Auditions, rejections, late nights, they became his reality. He was hungry, humble, and determined. There were no guarantees, no fame, no comfort. But there was passion. He found something in acting that philosophy couldn't give him, the ability to live through others, to feel every breath of humanity. One of his earliest breakthroughs came on Broadway, when he landed a role in Grease. He wasn't a superstar then, but those who watched him could already sense something rare, a quiet magnetism that didn't shout for attention but drew it naturally. Every step forward, every curtain call, every small paycheck carried him closer to something greater. He wasn't chasing fame, he was searching for purpose. And purpose, as it often does, was already on its way to find him. The transition from the stage to the screen is one of the hardest journeys any actor can make. The theater is alive, raw, intimate, forgiving. The camera, however, captures everything, every tremble, every doubt, every truth you cannot hide. But for Richard Gere, it was never about pretending, it was about being. He started with small television and film roles in the mid-1970s. They weren't glamorous. Some barely paid the bills. Yet, each project sharpened his craft and deepened his understanding of storytelling. He had no mentor, no roadmap, only instinct. And then came a role that changed everything. In 1978, Gere starred in Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven, a masterpiece of poetic cinema. It wasn't a loud, flashy performance, but it was unforgettable. Gere's quiet presence, the mix of vulnerability and strength, stole every frame. Critics noticed. Hollywood noticed. Suddenly, His name began to circulate in casting rooms and studio offices. Directors whispered, "There's something about him." By 1980, American Gigolo transformed him from a promising young actor into a global phenomenon. The tailored suits, the reflective sunglasses, the haunting loneliness behind the character. It was Gere, but it was also every man searching for identity in a world of illusions. That role didn't just make him famous, it defined an era.
Women adored him. Men wanted to be him.
Yet, behind the perfection of that image was a man deeply aware of its fragility. Fame, to Richard, was not a blessing, it was a test. He once said, "When people see you as an image, they stop seeing you as a person." And that was exactly what he feared. The years that followed were a blur of headlines, red carpets, and adoration. But fame, as dazzling as it is, always comes with a shadow. He began feeling the loneliness of success, the isolation that hides behind applause. The more the world celebrated him, the more he withdrew into himself. Even then, at the height of his fame, he was already searching for peace, for meaning beyond the screen. Still, destiny had more in store. The 1980s were only the beginning. The world had seen his charm, but not yet his heart. That revelation would come soon, and when it did, it would make Richard Gere not just a star but a legend. In 1980, the film American Gigolo arrived, and with it, a new kind of Hollywood star was born. By the time the 1990s ended, Richard Gere was no longer just a movie star. He was something more complicated, an artist, a thinker, and a man wrestling with his place in a world that celebrated illusions. Fame can fill a room but leave the heart empty. Richard Gere understood that better than anyone. Away from the cameras, his life was built on silence, reflection, and spiritual pursuit. In the late 1980s, long before it became fashionable in Hollywood, Gere found solace in Buddhism. He studied under Tibetan monks, embraced meditation, and began forming a deep friendship with the Dalai Lama, a bond that would last decades. In a world obsessed with success, Gere sought surrender. While others partied, he prayed. While others chased wealth, he sought wisdom. He once said, "The world can make you famous in a day and forget you in a week. The soul only remembers kindness." His home was filled not with trophies or posters but with books on compassion and inner peace. He practiced daily meditation, gave up many luxuries, and spoke often about the importance of love and forgiveness. But spirituality also brought isolation. His values no longer aligned with Hollywood's fast-paced culture. The man who once defined glamour now found himself detached from it. Directors still wanted him.
Studios still called.
But Gere's interests had shifted. He started choosing films that explored moral depth and emotional truth. Summersby, Primal Fear, Unfaithful, Chicago. Each performance felt like a reflection of his evolving inner world, restrained, thoughtful, honest. Friends noticed that his laugh had become quieter, his presence softer. He rarely attended Hollywood parties. He preferred being alone, or surrounded by monks, artists, and peace advocates. This retreat wasn't sadness. It was awakening. Richard Gere was no longer the man the world fell in love with in Pretty Woman. He was becoming the man he had always been destined to be, a seeker. And yet, as the world moved on, that peace would soon take a shape that fans around the globe would find both beautiful and heartbreaking. It happened quietly, no grand farewell, no final interview, no statement. Richard Gere simply faded from view. Around his mid-70s, fans began to notice his absence. There were no new films, no talk show appearances, no magazine features. The man who had once graced every cover and headline was now nowhere to be found. His last few public photos showed him walking hand in hand with his wife, his silver hair catching the sunlight, his smile serene but faint. He looked thinner, older, and almost unrecognizable to some. The internet erupted with concern.
Is he okay?
What happened to Richard Gere?
Questions multiplied.
Some speculated about his health. Others believed he had chosen a vow of privacy. But the truth, as always with Gere, was more spiritual than sensational. He had simply chosen silence. He had once said that fame is a kind of noise. It fills your life until you can't hear your own thoughts. And so, he walked away from it completely. He spent most of his time between his estate in upstate New York and Alejandra's family home in Spain. His days became a rhythm of meditation, reading, and time with his children. He loved feeding the birds in the garden, walking barefoot on the grass, and playing the piano softly in the evenings. Neighbors said he was kind, humble, always smiling but rarely talking about his past. "You would never think he was a movie star," one neighbor remarked. "He lives like a monk, quiet, content, invisible." But when rare photos surfaced online, showing his aged face and frail figure, fans were heartbroken. The Richard Gere they remembered elegant, powerful, ageless, was now a man marked by time. Yet, even in that transformation, there was beauty. Because his eyes still carried that same light, softer now, but still kind, still alive. Hollywood whispered that something must be wrong. But those who knew him best said he was simply living his truth. He no longer needed the world's applause. He had already found what everyone else was still searching for: peace. And perhaps that's why his disappearance feels so haunting, because in a world that worships attention, Richard Gere chose to disappear in the most graceful way imaginable.
No announcement. No farewell. Just silence.
And somewhere in that silence, fans could still hear the echo of his voice, calm, wise, and unforgettable. "I never cared about being remembered," he once said quietly. "I just hope I was kind." By his mid-70s, Richard Gere had quietly retreated from the noise of Hollywood. His estate in upstate New York, once a place for lavish gatherings and moments of reflection between films, became something more sacred, a refuge from time itself. Those who visited described it as a place that seemed untouched by the outside world, a landscape of rolling fields, whispering trees, and still ponds where one could almost hear the breath of silence. He spent long stretches there, often alone or with his wife Alejandra and their young son. When he wasn't in New York, he found comfort in the gentle hills of Spain, Alejandra's home country, where he could walk without being recognized, without the weight of fame following behind. Locals would sometimes spot him at dawn, walking barefoot through the dew-soaked grass or sitting quietly under olive trees, lost in thought. Music filled his solitude. Gere had always been drawn to the meditative sound of Tibetan chants and the plaintive resonance of piano notes echoing through an empty house. He spent hours playing, sometimes melodies from his youth, other times improvisations that no one but the wind would hear. Friends said that he had become a man of quiet rituals. Each morning began with meditation. Not the kind done for cameras or headlines, but the kind that reached deep into the soul. He would rise before the sun, light a single candle, and sit cross-legged before it until the light outside matched the flame's glow. It was during these moments that Richard Gere became, in a way, invisible to the world. His once constant presence in films and interviews faded to almost nothing. For fans, it was a painful realization. The man who had given them timeless performances, the charming rebel in American Gigolo, the haunted romantic in An Officer and a Gentleman, the magnetic heartthrob in Pretty Woman, was now only a faint echo of the past. Tabloids began to notice his absence. Headlines whispered, "Where is Richard Gere?" But there were no clear answers. To those who truly knew him, it wasn't disappearance, it was transformation. Gere had entered a different chapter, one that fame could never understand, the quiet dignity of stepping away. Still, when rare photos appeared, fans could not hold back their tears. His once bright smile seemed softer, his eyes reflective and distant, not from sadness, but from wisdom. The same man who once stood under blinding lights now found peace in shadows. And though the world missed him dearly, Richard Gere was finally learning how to just be. It began with a single photograph. A fan had spotted him in Madrid, walking slowly, wearing a hat and simple clothes, hand in hand with his wife. The image spread like wildfire online. Gone was the effortlessly youthful leading man the world had adored for decades. In his place stood a humble figure, aged but luminous in a way that words couldn't quite capture. "Is that really Richard Gere?" people asked. "What happened to him?" Social media was flooded with messages from fans who had grown up watching him. "He was my first crush," one woman wrote. "It hurts to see him like this." Others posted tributes, montages of his most unforgettable scenes, paired with emotional music and messages of gratitude. Across TikTok and YouTube, videos titled "The Gentle Soul of Richard Gere" gained millions of views. The collective reaction was one of heartbreak mixed with awe. People weren't just mourning his physical change, they were mourning time itself. The reminder that even the icons we thought untouchable eventually bow to the years struck deeply. Those who had followed Gere's humanitarian work understood something others didn't. This change wasn't tragedy.
It was grace.
He had spent so much of his life helping others, from Tibetan refugees to people living with AIDS, that perhaps he had simply given too much of himself. The lines on his face, the gentleness in his eyes, were not signs of loss, but of having lived deeply and truly. Still, fans couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. The rare glimpses of him walking quietly through airports or smiling faintly at small gatherings only deepened the ache. It was as though the curtain of a great era was slowly closing, and no one was ready to say goodbye. In interviews from years earlier, Richard Gere had spoken often about impermanence, how everything in life is fleeting, from fame to beauty to sorrow. But those words, once philosophical musings, now echoed with haunting truth. "I've never feared getting old," he once said softly during a press conference in Tokyo. The real tragedy would be to live a long life without compassion. Looking back, it was as if Gere had always known what lay ahead. He had seen the rise and fall of careers, the endless cycle of celebrity worship and abandonment. He knew how quickly the world forgets. And yet, he had made peace with it. Friends recalled that he often spoke of life as a river, something that flows on regardless of whether we fight against it or learn to float. You can't hold the water, he'd say. You just learn to move with it. Those who re-watched his interviews after his retreat from public life found themselves overcome with emotion. His words felt prophetic, almost like a farewell whispered long before anyone realized it. He had talked about letting go of ego, of fame, of attachment, not because he despised them, but because he had learned that love and stillness meant more. In one particularly moving exchange, he told a reporter, "Everything we think we own, even our name, is borrowed. The only thing that's truly ours is how we make others feel." Today, those words feel like a mirror to his legacy. An actor who gave the world not just performances but presence. For all the glamour and success that defined Richard Gere's early years, his truest impact came not from his films, but from his heart. Long before celebrity philanthropy became fashionable, Gere was walking quietly into refugee camps in India, meeting with monks in Dharamshala, and using his wealth to bring attention to the suffering of the Tibetan people. He founded the Gere Foundation, which supported countless humanitarian efforts, but he rarely spoke about them. Those who worked alongside him described him as humble to the core. He didn't arrive with cameras or press releases. He arrived with open hands. He once said, "If compassion has an agenda, it's no longer compassion." Over the years, Gere's humanitarian work expanded to include AIDS awareness and global poverty relief. His support for Tibetan independence cost him dearly in Hollywood. Studios distanced themselves, award ceremonies turned cold, but he never once regretted it. "Silence," he said, "is the most dangerous thing when people are suffering." Even as his fame waned, the quiet testimonies of those he helped began to surface. Refugees spoke of a kind American man who listened without judgment. Monks spoke of his humility. Volunteers remembered his laughter, light, unguarded, almost childlike. Richard Gere didn't just play roles that inspired people, he lived a life that embodied empathy. And now, as fans look back at his journey, from the bright lights of Pretty Woman to the silent hills of Spain, there's one undeniable truth. Richard Gere's greatest performance was not on screen, but in the way he lived when no one was watching. From the outside, Richard Gere's life looked like a portrait of serenity. His career had spanned more than 5 decades, his humanitarian work was globally respected, and he had found love later in life. Yet beneath the calm surface, there was an unspoken ache, the kind of quiet pain that never makes headlines, but lingers in the spaces between smiles. Those closest to him knew. They saw it in the pauses between his laughter, in the way he would sometimes drift into silence at gatherings. The man who once carried entire films on his charm and confidence now moved with the gentleness of someone carrying invisible weight. For years, Gere had struggled with the quiet realities of aging, not vanity, but relevance. In an industry obsessed with youth, he found himself gently pushed aside. Scripts stopped coming as often. The spotlight that once chased him now passed over him without a glance. It wasn't bitterness that filled him, but a deep melancholy, the realization that every artist must one day fade into the background of the very stage they once ruled. Friends remembered the evenings he would sit by his piano, playing the same haunting melody over and over again. A tune he never named, one that seemed to belong only to him. When asked what it meant, he would smile softly and say, "It's about time, how it gives and takes." But his private struggles went deeper than career transitions. Gere had always been introspective, almost spiritual in his approach to pain. He didn't deny it, he transformed it. Through meditation, prayer, and compassion for others, he found ways to turn his inner wounds into light for the world. Still, in his 70s, the loss of many dear friends and contemporaries took its toll. He spoke less often in public, writing letters instead, reflections on love, forgiveness, and the impermanence of fame. To those who read them, they were nothing short of poetry. Behind the smile that captivated millions was a man coming to terms with the truth that all things, even beauty, youth, and success, are fleeting. And yet, within that truth, Richard Gere found a deeper beauty, the peace of letting go. When the world finally noticed his absence, the response was overwhelming. For years, Richard Gere had quietly stepped out of the public eye, but fans refused to forget him. The moment rare photos began circulating, showing him thinner, older, but still carrying that unmistakable dignity, social media lit up with emotion. Across TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook, tributes poured in, montages of his most unforgettable roles set to tearful music, clips of his interviews where he spoke of love and compassion, and comments filled with gratitude and disbelief. He gave us decades of beauty and truth, one fan wrote. Seeing him like this breaks my heart. Celebrities who had worked with him, from Julia Roberts to Diane Lane, shared personal reflections. Richard taught me that kindness on a film set matters more than fame, one said. Others recalled his quiet humor, his patience with young actors, and his insistence that every person, no matter their role, deserved respect. As the days passed, what began as curiosity became a wave of collective mourning, not because he was gone, but because the world realized how deeply it had missed him. TV networks began airing retrospectives of his career. Pretty Woman, An Officer and a Gentleman, Chicago, Arbitrage. His performances were rediscovered by a new generation. Young viewers, many of whom had never seen him on screen before, found themselves deeply moved. But what truly broke hearts wasn't his aging face or frail frame. It was the realization that he had quietly lived the very lessons he spent his career portraying: grace, empathy, and emotional truth. The world wasn't crying for the loss of a movie star. It was crying for the reminder that all beauty fades, all fame dims, and yet love, the kind he radiated both on and off screen, endures. When the whispers grew louder, what really happened to Richard Gere? Those closest to him finally spoke. There was no tragedy, no scandal, no hidden disaster. The truth was far simpler, and infinitely more powerful. Richard Gere had chosen peace. He had deliberately stepped away from Hollywood, from constant attention, from the weight of expectation. After decades of living under a microscope, he wanted to live in stillness, to raise his young son away from cameras, to spend time with his wife Alejandra in quiet devotion, to meditate, read, and live in alignment with the Buddhist principles that had guided him for years. His health had slowed him slightly, not dramatically, but enough to remind him of his mortality. He moved more gently, spoke more softly, laughed more quietly. But there was no fear in him, no bitterness about time. Instead, there was profound acceptance. He told a close friend, "I spent half my life pretending to be other people. Now I just want to remember who I really am." And so, what the world mistook for disappearance was, in truth, awakening. Richard Gere hadn't vanished, he had transformed. He had found the kind of peace most people spend their lives chasing. The world cried because it misunderstood the stillness as sadness. But for Gere, it was the opposite. It was liberation. His life had never been about clinging to fame, it was about releasing it. And in that release, he became more timeless than ever. The tributes began quietly, almost reverently, as if the world collectively understood that Richard Gere's story was no longer just about an actor, but about a man who had become something greater. Hollywood veterans, journalists, directors, and co-stars began to speak of him not with nostalgia, but with awe. Julia Roberts once said, "Richard wasn't just a co-star, he was the calm in every storm. When I think of grace, I think of him." Her words echoed across generations. Those who had grown up watching Pretty Woman or An Officer and a Gentleman suddenly realized that his characters weren't fiction, they were reflections of who he truly was. Film historians often describe Richard Gere as the eternal gentleman, a title that fits him perfectly. He redefined masculinity in an era that often equated strength with arrogance. Gere's strength was in his silence, his empathy, and his ability to express emotion without words. His presence on screen was never loud, it was magnetic, a stillness that drew audiences in. In An Officer and a Gentleman, he gave us one of the most unforgettable climaxes in cinema history, carrying Deborah Winger in his arms as the music soared. In Pretty Woman, he reminded us that kindness could exist even in the unlikeliest of stories. And in Chicago, his portrayal of the slick lawyer Billy Flynn became proof that charisma, when wielded with intelligence, was an art form. Each performance carried a part of his soul, tender, flawed, human. Decades later, film schools teach his style of acting not as a performance, but as presence. He didn't act emotions, one professor wrote. He became them. But Gere's legacy is more than cinematic. He showed the world that a leading man could age with dignity, without clinging to the desperate illusion of youth. His white hair, his gentle wrinkles, his measured tone, all became symbols of authenticity in a world obsessed with reinvention. To this day, when his old movies play, viewers still feel it, that timeless warmth, that sincerity, that quiet decency. Richard Gere may have stepped away from Hollywood, but his spirit never left. His characters remain alive, in the memories of millions who found in him a reflection of the love, humility, and grace they hope to one day embody. As the years went by, Richard Gere's public appearances grew fewer, until they stopped entirely. There were no press releases, no statements, just silence. And in that silence, there was something profoundly poetic. The world, so used to noise and spectacle, struggled to understand it at first. How could a man so beloved, so celebrated, simply disappear? But those who looked closer began to see the beauty in it. Gere's silence wasn't absence, It was peace speaking in its purest form. In his quiet retreat, his estate tucked among the trees of upstate New York, or his home beneath the Spanish sun, he found what most spend a lifetime searching for: stillness. Each morning, he would rise before dawn. The world outside his window was painted in soft shades of gold.
A thin mist clung to the grass.
Sometimes, he would sit by the piano, his hands resting on the keys without pressing them, listening instead to the sound of the wind moving through the open window. The notes of forgotten melodies still echoed faintly in the room. A photograph of the Dalai Lama sat near the window ledge, catching the light. Books lined the shelves: philosophy, poetry, Buddhist scriptures, all worn at the edges, as if touched countless times in contemplation. Neighbors would occasionally see him walking slowly through the fields, a small hat shading his face, a notebook tucked under his arm. He often stopped to watch birds or to gaze at the river that cut across the land. The world around him moved in chaos, yet his world, that small patch of earth and sky, remained calm. And though no cameras captured it, that silence was his final masterpiece. Because in truth, Richard Gere had spent his life teaching others how to feel, through his art, his compassion, and his humanity. And now, through his quiet disappearance, he taught one last lesson: that peace is not found in being seen, but in learning to simply exist. There was something almost cinematic in that, a man who began his journey under blinding lights, ending it in gentle shadows. For those who loved him, that realization was bittersweet. It made the tears come easily, because they understood that the man who once filled theaters with his smile had chosen instead to fill the earth with silence, a silence more eloquent than words. If Richard Gere's journey touched your heart today, if his story reminded you of compassion, grace, and the quiet beauty of life, then don't leave without showing your love and support. Like this video to honor the timeless legacy of one of Hollywood's most gentle souls. Subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt documentaries about the legends who shaped our world. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, so you never miss the stories that move you. Stories that remind us all what it truly means to live, to love, and to let go.